Wake up, Lo-Fi Nation. It's a very special Wednesday. And welcome everyone to the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pickering. That's right. Lo-Fi's and low fidelity, low quality, in your face, messy as can be global news show. It's Wednesday and time for that Lo-Fi global news. But here with us to talk about that famous question, what's going on in the world today, I couldn't be happier to introduce to all of you a very good friend of ours, Dr. Robert Worth, a political scientist instructor at the University of New Orleans. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of New Orleans and a master's in international relations from the City College of New York. His research is currently focused on the effects of race, demographic change, and immigration on voters and institutions in the United States and Europe. Additionally, he is deeply skeptical of people who eat with sporks. Dr. Worth, aka Dr. Bob, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, and thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting. I've been following your work and listening each week, and it's fun to be a part of it.
Oh, we are so happy for you to be with us. But let's go ahead and dive right into it. Let's talk about that news fresh off that press. We want to talk about a new prosecutor for the ICC, aka the International Criminal Court. And Dr. Worth, as an opener, what exactly is the International Criminal Court? Then we can jump into this new prosecutor thing.
So, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the basic explanation is it's an international court that is charged with prosecuting individuals, and that's the big deal there. We've had the International Court of Justice ever since the conclusion of World War II. It hears disputes between states. But what really makes the ICC remarkable is it's an international institution with legal jurisdiction over individuals, right? That's not something that's happened before. And so we'll get into, the ICC's record and its performance, but I think just the mere fact that it exists and 123 countries or states party to it, this is a big deal. It's, in my opinion, difficult to overstate just how remarkable the development that is.
Well, I think you are absolutely right. I mean, in all of human history, there has never been an international criminal court that actually functions on such a global level. Um, okay, so we got what it does, but what's the deal with this new prosecutor now? Is this hot news or just same old international relations?
I think were we having this conversation 5, 10 years ago, there wouldn't really be much to it. He seems to be qualified. The election process was very contentious with a lot of countries. Basically, they had to go back and regroup several times. That's to be expected in an institution like this. There's nothing, particularly remarkable there. Were we not in this moment globally where countries, including the United States, including China, Russia, obviously, are kind of backing away from the little world order that the United States has created over the last couple of decades, moving in a more realist direction, growing skepticism and outright rejection of international institutions, including the court. So, given the current moment that we're in, maybe this is a bigger deal than I would have argued 5, 10 years ago.
Oh, I mean, those are all great points. The trend, and I like the fact you bring in a little IR realist perspective there. I'm not going to say if I agree with that realism or not, but hey, I like to hear it all the same. Um, but you do bring up a good point. You bring up the US, you bring up Russia, you bring up China, and that makes me think the US, for its part, if I remember correctly, does not subscribe to the jurisdiction of the ICC. Is that correct?
That is correct. And moreover, so right, we are not a state's party to it. But moreover, the Trump administration issued an executive order barring ICC prosecutors from entering the United States because they were sort of hinting around that they might start investigating some people here. Notably, Biden has very quietly let that executive order stand and has said publicly that he might consider re-engaging with the court on, I can't remember his exact language, but extremely limited basis or something like that. There is no ambiguity there. So, right, I don't think we can necessarily say that this was just a Trump thing and everything's back to quote unquote normal now.
Right. I mean, and the United States, even before the current administration and the previous administration, we were not under the jurisdiction of the ICC. This is nothing new at all. And like we said earlier, about 120 countries are part of that. That still leaves almost 80 countries in the world, give or take, that are not. But I do want to ask you, and you talked about the record a little bit. So we do have to point out that the International Criminal Court has a pretty biased record of prosecuting individuals from Africa in comparison to other places. How do you view that?
It's not good, is sort of the simple way of putting it. Whatever one thinks legally about the justification of that, you hear a lot of arguments that the sort of crimes that the court was the spirit of the thing, right, is to hold heads of state and very high ranking military leaders accountable for human rights violations. You hear a lot of arguments that, well, more of those violations are happening in Africa, therefore, that's where the court's going to focus its attention. Whether or not that's true or not, to me, kind of misses the point because at this point, I think the significance and the importance of the court is in institutionalizing and helping to further develop these emerging norms around human rights. Think like the responsibility to protect, right? That sovereignty is conditional on certain human rights norms being upheld. That's a very, 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 very nascent norm. But I think at this point, it's more about an institution being seen as legitimate and fair and equitable to help develop those norms rather than focusing purely on its legal performance. And so, right, given that, it sure looks like a biased track record to me, and I think most other people, certainly in that respect, I think it's a problem.
Oh, you said so many words in there. I want to jump on to responsibility to protect, sovereignty. Oh, but so much to unpack there. But we do need to keep moving on. There's just so much to say. But next up, the new head of the WTO, aka the World Trade Organization. And Dr. Worth is an entry into this story. What is the World Trade Organization? And what's the deal with this new head of the organization?
So, the World Trade Organization is yet another one of these liberal institutions that the United States kind of spearheaded in the aftermath of World War II. And what it seeks to do is to regularize trade, to promote trade, to provide an institutional setting in which states can settle trade disputes. And just think liberalism 101, right? We're trying to use an international organization to facilitate cooperation, create positive sum outcomes. In this instance, ideally, everybody gets rich. And it's certainly, in terms of scope, been a very important, successful organization. 164 member states, 96% of global trade and global GDP is subject to the World Trade Organization. So, whatever we think of the material outcomes politically, it's been, I think, a very important success story.
Oh, so much going on there, and increasing in the number of countries that take part in comparison to the ICC. The WTO has over 160 countries that take part, makes up the vast majority of the world economy. But at the same time, I push back a little bit because we have seen recently over the past decade and before that you mentioned dispute resolution. So this is particularly when two members countries have a dispute about trade. We could say, for instance, China and the US. They can both go to the World Trade Organization and they have a dispute resolution body within it to solve those issues. However, that resolution, that body has been on the downfall, right? What's the story there?
Absolutely. Beginning with the financial crisis 2007 through 2009, the Washington Consensus, which had just kind of taken on a rather taken for granted character, certainly amongst many of the powerful countries of the world, that freer trade is always good, period, right? Circumstances don't really matter. It became an axiom. Well, beginning with the financial crisis, people started to kind of rethink that, right? They said maybe this global economic order, including our trading regimes, maybe this isn't just sort of by fiat the best way of doing things. Enter in the last 10 years or so since then, as we've been moving away from international institutions, moving away from cooperation. Certainly, the US, China, and Russia beginning to view things like trade in more zero sum sorts of ways. And this has culminated with Trump put a block on new appointees to the dispute resolution bodies such that it hasn't done anything in a year, right? It's been effectively sort of frozen. So, as with everything we've been discussing, 10 years ago, this conversation would have been very different. 5 years ago, this conversation would have been very different. And that's why it's such a big deal that we've got this new WTO chief, significant in that she's the first woman to head the organization, the first African. Her credentials, in my opinion, she's very well, qualified for the job. She's got her work cut out for her to keep this both a functioning and relevant organization.
No, I agree. I mean, the fact that the first woman, the first African to be head of the WTO, fantastic. Extremely great moves going forward. To add inclusivity and to especially bring African countries' interest to the WTO, which many people have argued for a very long time. The WTO very much benefits richer countries rather than developing countries. So this could mark a real shift in that mentality and how we view the WTO. I'm very, very interested to see how this turns out moving forward for sure. So many things going on in the world today, but ain't nobody got time to focus on just one thing. Oh no. Our following topic dives into Middle Eastern country of Iran and the nuclear deal the country set up with other world powers. So what's this all about? This nuclear deal, Iran, sanctions, negotiations. What are we talking about, Dr. Worth?
So, the so called Iran nuclear deal was an agreement between Iran and the P5 plus one, the permanent five members of the Security Council, plus Germany, in which Iran agreed to give up certain elements of its nuclear program. And the reason I say nuclear program is this spans perfectly legitimate civilian nuclear power uses, for example, on through the possibility of developing nuclear weapons. Iran agreed to suspend all sorts of activities to allow monitoring in exchange for the lifting of sanctions that had been placed on Iran. Hugely controversial from the start. Israel was not a party to this thing. They said it doesn't even go close to far enough. Others said it went too far. As is so often the case in recent years, in a rather kind of inexplicably rash way, Trump removed the US from the deal, throwing everything into disarray. Now Biden is saying, let's come back to the table. Let's see what we can come up with. Let's try and get something done. Let's try to move somewhere in a good direction.
Right, that does seem to be where we are at currently. However, Iran is very vocal about saying if you want us back at the table, get rid of the sanctions imposed on us during the Trump administration. And it seems like the Biden administration is signaling that's not going to happen. Come to the table first. So, how do the two countries reconcile that issue? Or rather, do they even reconcile that? I mean, honestly, does this Iran nuclear deal seem salvageable?
Yeah, I too pick up on your skepticism and I very much share it. It's just not real clear to me what sort of leverage the United States and its allies, because again, this is, the P5 plus one, but we're kind of leading the charge. It's not clear to me what leverage that group has because Iran apparently can weather the sanctions. They're not happy about them. It's not doing them any good, but they're hanging on. When it comes to international reputation, Iran is very familiar with being something of an international pariah, and they don't seem to have any issues with that status. And moreover, Iran isn't pursuing these different nuclear programs just because, right? They're pursuing them for leverage. And frankly, if we don't want them to pursue those programs, they have a lot of leverage over us. And so I agree, if I'm picking up on your tone right, that I'm not super optimistic about this thing.
Yeah, in many ways, I am quite skeptical about the direction of where this Iran nuclear deal can go. Is it even salvageable? Simply because, in my perspective, this one issue is not in isolation of others. It's connected to the greater discussion of Iran in the Middle East, Iran internationally, and so many separate foreign relation issues will influence how the P5+1 react to Iran on this one particular issue as well.
Absolutely. It's without question, Iran has regional interests, and Iran is a very powerful player in the region. And it's worth noting that the P5+1 does not consist of a single country from that region. And so, yeah, that certainly I don't think is doing them any favors trying to get this thing resolved.
Yes, we will have to wait a little bit longer to see, but all right, all right, all right. We got to switch topics again. This time, per someone else's request other than my own, because lo-fi listeners out there know this ain't my bag. But today, oh, we're going to dive into it for sure. The topic: first world countries, aka rich countries, aka Western democracies, and their hoarding of the vaccine, and Covax. Dr. Worth, I'm so happy you're going to talk to us about this one. What you got for us?
This is a difficult one. To date, while the rich world, however you want to define it, we know it when we see it, is moving ahead, with vaccinations. 14% of the richest population has purchased about half of all vaccines. As of a week and a half ago, within the 90 poorest countries, only 100 doses had been administered. That's not a slip up, that's not a typo, 100. And so clearly there is profound inequity in terms of who is receiving access to the coronavirus vaccine. And yet, what to do about it is a little bit more complicated of a question.
Exactly, exactly. And just to give our listeners some perspective, could you tell us real quick what is COVAX?
COVAX is this kind of umbrella term for an international effort on behalf of several different organizations with, in theory, the backing of the rich world to get these vaccines into the developing world. I think that's pretty much as simple as it gets.
Right, right. It's backed by the United Nations, it's backed by the World Health Organization, and 92 countries in the world are part of COVAX, and they will get the vaccines through COVAX for free. But another 90 countries in the world are also part of COVAX and paying for the vaccines. That's 182 countries in the world. That's almost all of them, if you think around 200 countries, give or take. However, like you said, as far as the numbers go, last week, Ghana was the only country out of those 92 who were getting it for free that had received a shipment. And in this past week, Ivory Coast just received their first shipment as well. But like you said, distribution is still a major issue.
Yeah, not only is distribution a major issue, so more and more countries are signing on to COVAX. More and more rich countries are pledging funding. This year they have a funding shortfall of 6.4 billion. Just to take the US as an example, the Biden administration has pledged not only are we going to join, because not surprisingly, the Trump administration did not, we'll give you $4 billion. This is good, right? This is progress. On the other hand, all the money in the world doesn't really help if the rich countries are nonetheless buying up the actual physical vaccine, right? Buying up the supply. And so this is another tricky one that, you hear the expression rich countries join COVAX so that they look good, but then they buy all the vaccines anyway. And so, yet again, not to overuse the cliche, but COVAX has its work cut out for it as well.
This is most certainly true. And really, whenever we're talking about international relations and comparative politics, and we're talking about developing countries specifically here and health crises, in developing country. And I want to put a question forward to you. You know, as a health crisis, in your perspective, is there any difference between this current health crisis for developing countries in comparison to, let's say, Ebola or AIDS or any number of major diseases and virus that these developing countries face, but yet they face them all without resources?
Yeah, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, because, right, in terms of resources and infrastructure, no different and not a good situation. On the other hand, because this is a global pandemic, the rich world, incidentally, and it's kind of, you usually don't see this pattern, the rich world to date has been disproportionately affected. The United States, with 4% of the world's population, has about 20% of COVID 19 deaths. It's starting to spread, say, in sub Saharan Africa, but they've been slower, but it's coming, right? There's no question that it's coming. The interest for the rich world, in a purely self interested, pragmatic way, is the sooner they can stop the spread of this thing globally, the fewer variants are going to emerge, right? So if we ignore the developing world, variants will emerge there. They will make it to the rich world eventually. So even from the most sort of self interested perspective, I think maybe this is a little bit of a different situation because it does behoove the rich world to care, even if to date maybe they don't care as much as certainly I would like to see.
Truly, one of the dominant topics of the world today, and a portion of the story that gets far too little attention. And thank you for bringing it up to Lo-Fi Nation and talking to us about it for real. But now, moving forward, because we never move on from anything, our final topic, a story to send you on your way for the day. It's the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. And Dr. Worth, what is this Arab Spring? And what does it mean for the world today?
So, the Arab Spring was a series of protests and toppling of dictatorial regimes throughout the Arab world almost 10 years ago, not quite to the day. It was December something 2010 when this began with a fruit salesperson in Tunisia self immolating himself in response to corruption and bribery. And it really did, in a way that nobody saw coming and could have seen coming, spread throughout the region in a really just, it was something to see, it was something to witness. The downside is that as we reflect on it 10 years later, I don't think that the Arab Spring was even close to as successful as many people had hoped, myself included.
Right. In many aspects, we tend to measure success in the Arab Spring. And to be a little more specific too, so we're talking 20 to 30 different countries where massive protest movements took to the streets to overthrow authoritarian governments. And of those 20 to 30, maybe 6 of them were successful at overthrowing the governments. And of those 6, only one of them successfully democratized. The other 5, 2 of them still in the middle of civil war, Syria and Yemen. 3 of the others severely, severely repressed. And in particular, Egypt. They democratized, military coup took place, and then authoritarianism returned in much the same fashion that it was previous to the Arab Spring. So if we are measuring success of the Arab Spring as far as turning authoritarian countries into democracies, yes, it does look like it was largely unsuccessful. Although, would you say that's the only way that we should necessarily measure success of this movement?
Yeah, and the short answer would be no, because, we can throw in a few more dismal statistics: about a half a million people dead from the resulting unrest, 16 million people displaced. Like you said, we've got civil wars that broke out. Depending on whose measure you use, many of the countries, well, all of these affected countries, with the exception of Tunisia, are arguably less free or less democratic than they were before the Arab Spring began. So, on the one hand, yeah, there's plenty of measurable outcomes that aren't so good. On the other hand, and this gets back to this idea of norms and their development. It's easy for me to be optimistic from, my comfortable perch halfway around the world. But just the fact that we had a region wide uprising and demand of democracy, that shed another one of those things that, in 2009, no one would have expected that. Many people would have wanted that, but you or I wouldn't have said, it seems like the Middle East is ripe for region wide democratization. So even though it failed, the mere fact that this desire that was so intensely felt by these populations, I think that's more than nothing, even if it's very easy for me to be optimistic in that way.
I think you are absolutely right. I think there, regardless of the down look that you might have or the pessimism one may say from the outcomes of the Arab Spring, in many ways, it shows that the possibility for change is there and that the people know it's there and that it can happen in the future. So I think that potential will always be there. And the Arab Spring, and one of the greatest legacies of the Arab Spring, is that these people now know more than ever that they do have the power to change their future if they want to. I think that's a pretty powerful legacy for sure.
I could not agree more and could not have said it better.
So, and really right now, we're also looking at countries like Thailand and Myanmar with mass people's power movements in that one region trying to overthrow authoritarianism there. And will they learn some very important lessons from the Arab Spring?
Yeah, that's a really good perspective. And I have to admit, not one that I had necessarily considered, given my own nationality and whatnot. But yeah, that's a profoundly good example because it's worth remembering that, the Arab Spring, this was the first sort of social media movement, and how accurate that is and whether or not the media made more of that than they should have is a conversation for another time. But nonetheless, it's clear that Facebook played a huge role in organizing during the Arab Spring. Twitter played a huge role in providing real time information. And so, if nothing else, just the sort of revolutionizing technological aspect of it, that alone is a really important and I think hopeful thing.
Oh, I agree with you completely. Technology is changing the way that media and politics interact, and it's changing the way we interact with the world around us. And with that, my friend, our conversation of lo-fi global news comes to a close, though our stories are never truly over. Dr. Bob, I cannot thank you enough for coming onto the show with us today. Please, anytime in the future, do come back.
Oh, right back at you. Thank you for having me. And yes, we should definitely do this again.
Oh, I most certainly look forward to it because you are Lofi Poli Sci, my friend. And that's a brief snapshot of what's going on in the world today. Stay tuned for tomorrow's episode of Lo-Fi Global News. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, wash those hands, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Lo-Fi Poli Sci podcast. Worth and Pickering, signing off.